Welcome to Stellar Strategy Gaming. This is Mara and Ben. Today we're going to be talking about being a noob DM, DMing your first campaign. This can be really overwhelming to begin with. You never know exactly how complex to make the interactions, how complex to build out your world, and what your players are going to do. But I gotta say, once you get into it, it is just so much fun, and it is so rewarding when everyone at the table is loving what you're doing.
Yes, now, the pinnacle point of my talking points is to not get ambitious. I will revisit this throughout the video, but the key factor is just to stay in sort of your lane when you're starting out. It's actually a rule which applies to writing as well, is you're allowed to break the rules only when you understand the rules first. And a very good example of when this sort of worked but sort of didn't at the same time was in an earlier campaign I ran with Ben a while back, whereby I had this high magic, high fantasy world, and I think I had the god Hadar approaching from the distance or something along those lines. And it was actually a fun time. Everyone seemed to enjoy it. The issue was I built a bit too big for myself, so even though it was a fun time, I physically couldn't maintain the 3 hours of planning it really required to have the story in mind and to figure out what happens if the players go off script. Which, especially if you have a complex storyline, you have to remember that players going off script is going to do a lot more damage than if you have a session-to-session storyline.
Absolutely. My first campaign, I built it off of the time period of the late Bronze Age collapse, which I had a whole filled out world with maps and backstories and on, and we never touched most of it. Now, this actually did come in handy later on because I have a rule for when you're making your character, which is write 10 pages but give the group one because that's all anybody cares about. Something actually very similar can apply to DMing and world building. In my current campaign that I'm running with Mara, I'm using the same world, but I only focused on a very narrow strip of it. So all the players have to deal with is it's a coastal region, there are some ruined cities on the coast, and everything's been rebuilt further inland.
Yes, now, there are some great examples you can draw from here. One that I personally loved especially was the Dragon Prince series, as well as Castlevania. That one also works very well, where I'm going to use Dragon Prince as the first example, then Castlevania. With Dragon Prince, the first season, the world isn't fully established yet. You have one small kingdom, and you have the conflict approaching that small kingdom. Now, the second season, that changes. You then have a bigger world because your heroes have ventured out, so you need to understand more of the rules in order to really get a good idea of what's going on. And then in the third season, it's a full-scale, like, battles and all that. So that's actually a very good way to sort of do that as well, is not just give your players one page of information, but be sure to give them that one page of information, but then slowly fill it out from there. Castlevania does this too. In the first season, it's like the region of Wallachia, I think, and it doesn't even tell you where Dracula is going. He's just like, oh yeah, we're just going to execute everybody in this vaguely defined area. But then by season 3, it's like this global conflict involving all the vampires and all that, ranging from the freaking Alps all the way to the deserts. So,
And as important it is to not go overboard with your geography, it's also important not to go overboard with your backstory in terms of lore and history within the world. A good example of this would be Lord of the Rings. It's an example both of how it's done right and how it's done wrong. In both the books and the movies, it gives you just a vague history of the War of the Ring and who Sauron is, but it pretty much just goes right into the story. Now, Tolkien, for reasons known only to himself, decided we really did need the whole backstory of Middle-earth in written form, which is how we got the Silmarillion.
a book which no one has ever completed.
I've known a few people who've completed the Silmarillion, and they're all people that some of them were actually very close to me and good friends, but I still wonder what undiagnosed personality disorder they had that allowed them to do that. The point is, there again, getting back to the world I referenced of my own creation, rather than giving the players the whole entire backstory of the Bronze Age collapse or the magical mythical version of it, I gave them a much narrower. The cities were here, they were prosperous trade hubs. They got raided and wrecked, and there was also a peasant revolt at the same time as the invasion. Now the cities are destroyed and considered to be ruined and haunted places. That's all the players needed for the start. They just had this vision of a post-apocalyptic fantasy world, and you don't need a whole lot more than that. Now that we're done talking a little bit about the geography and history of your world, we're going to get a little bit more into some of the more technical aspects of how you're going to set it up for your players.
Yes. Something I've seen all too many times is the new player throwing magic items at, or the new DM throwing new magic items at their players. In fact, there was a game a few years back where I was playing a tiefling warlock of Emrukiel or something. I think it was a custom patron. And the DM threw a magic sword at us for some reason, and that was just... And that wasn't the only magic item, but it was insanely powerful. And that was first session we got that magic item. And it reached the point where I think it only had 2 sessions, but by the second session we had like multiple pages of magic item information, which can really bog down a game. And especially for newer players, it also just doesn't feel as good to get a magic item if they're so common, you know? If you fight a dozen battles and get 1 magic item for those dozen, sure, you're not getting as much reward out of all the battles, but it's going to feel so much better for your players when they get the +2 dagger or whatever it is. And in fact, that leads me into my next point, which is there is a way you can supplement magic items if you're thinking, oh, well, but they need these magic items to win, which is spell scrolls. I personally love, because instead of giving your players the Periapt of Healing, which is completely overpowered as an item, you could give them the Scroll of Healing Word if they don't have a cleric, or things like that, you know? But it also forces them to sort of economize their items a bit. They have to figure out when to use it, because it is expendable.
Something I sometimes do in campaigns, especially if I notice a specific lack in a party, for example, if there's no clearly defined healer in the party, is that I'll have the quest giver, whoever that may be, give the party something that makes up for their lack of whatever ability that is. So, for example, if you have a party that doesn't have a clear tank in the party, you might be a little bit more generous with magical armor. One that sometimes has come up for me is we'll have a party with no clearly defined healer, so I'll have the quest giver give out 1 or more flasks as appropriate to the party in campaign, where it can be filled from any source. Once per day, you can drink the contents of the flasks and regain 20 HP. And there again, because it has limited use, players can only use it so many times, and as a DM, it helps prevent you from writing yourself into a corner where you have to fill in something, or where you put yourself into a situation where you're killing your party in a way that's not fun or interesting. What not to do that I've seen too many DMs do, and actually have been guilty of myself, is that they do a Mary Sue or Gary Sue NPC that they insert into the story who has some sort of ability that the rest of the party lacks. The problem is, at that point, the DM is a player character, and you're having the character you've created play against the monsters you've created. Unless you're in a very specific variety of adult entertainment, nobody wants to watch you playing with yourself, so don't do it.
Yes, and I will actually mention, just before I move on, that another good thing with magic items especially is in one of the campaigns Ben ran a while back, he did give out a very powerful set of magic items at the start of the campaign, which improved any stat to 20 of the player's choice. But all of them were cursed, so that we could not take them off and had to complete the quest. And oh my god, the table reactions. It was great.
Yes, and that actually was one of the most passionate and immediate responses I've ever gotten from anything I've ever done as a DM. And it was the kind of thing where the players were talking about it to me for a significant period of time after the campaign was over. And I remember one of them in hindsight saying, like, you know what, even if I had known it was cursed with what it had on it, I would have taken it anyway. What was really neat about it also, as a tool for a first-time DM, That is just the definition of railroading. Like, you have this cursed item that won't let you go off path, but you know what? It worked. It made the campaign work.
And in fact, that actually feeds really well into the next subject, which is themes and randomness, which is that you cannot just throw something together on the fly and expect it to fit into whatever world you have built. Again, seen this too many times, been guilty of it myself, but a game that comes to mind, I believe we call this person Phil, ran a city campaign at one point, and there was a robot just wandering around for some reason, and then there were not robots, and then there were city guards, and then there was a gnome who was trying to escape. It was a bit confusing, to say the least. Oh, and there was this magic garden. Like, my confusion here proves the point, which is that it wasn't really themed around anything, and on top of that, it was so random that it disoriented the players. And so even if you had a good time during a session, because of how confusing it was, you couldn't necessarily reminisce on it, nor could you prepare for the future. And I do think that that is one of the best parts of D&D, is being able to say, oh, well, I got X last game, and we did X last game, so we can do X next game. That is truly a great part of it. In fact, a mechanic I don't see used enough is the carousing mechanic, and this might be a little off topic, but for new DMs, if you need a break from DMing for a little while, use the carousing mechanic. They just have your players do something to get a little experience and cash for a month or something in-game, and that'll give you an extra week or two to prepare a session.
So an encounter that I did that went really, really well, I thought. The players got the quest from the quest giver. They were getting provisioned in town, and somebody in town was asking where they were going and what they were doing. One of the players decided to do an insight check on this person to see what he was about. They rolled the nat 1, so they did not divine what his motives was, and shockingly, after revealing where they were going and what they were doing, the party was waylaid by bandits essentially attempting to extort them for money in order to get past. It made sense in the world. There was a clear setup to this encounter. It made a certain amount of sense that this encounter would happen. In addition, this party happened to be all women. So I had the bandit leader offer to let them pay tribute, as he put it, of the tender kind, at which point I had every player roll a Constitution saving throw. One of them rolled low. It had no effect on in-game ability, but I just, for narrative purposes, I was like, he says this, you throw up in your mouth a little bit. As a guy, I could be wrong, but my suspicion is that it's very hard to find a woman who wouldn't leap at the opportunity to, in a safe, consensual fantasy roleplay setting, only stab a Chad to death if given that opportunity. So it made sense in the game. It also made sense for the players. It was a rewarding, satisfying experience for the players without having to go into the cackling evil guy is evil, blah, blah, blah. Thank you so much for watching. We really appreciate your support. Next time, we're going to be talking about how to deal with that guy, what to do with problem players at the table. Thank you again. We'll see you on the next one.